Okay, hi everyone, my name is Helen, I prefer she or Madam Chair. With me,
Daniel, I prefer you, David.
James, not bothered.
Sophia Shirley. And
Shiraz. Hey. Wait, that is what I was supposed to say, right?
yes,
Good.
indeed. Without further ado, I'd like to call on the Prime Minister to open the case that stands on her name. You're here.
Honourable panel, the history of primaries in America has been one broadly in which many radicals have been nominated consistently over the history of the late half of the 20th century. And in doing so, that has led to situations whereby elections couldn't, first of all, have candidates who represented the broad interests of those parties, but moreover, oftentimes where certain candidates in those elections were unelectable, and also we have trends in recent times where the effects that is occurring leads to downward trends to other congressional elections, which also leads in Congress becoming one in which governance is getting harder and harder to do because of more and more radicalisation. We're going to talk to you about two things. One, why primaries are unfair and why our situation is comparatively better. Secondly, we're going to talk to you about why the status quo radicalises and polarises American politics. So, what are we going to do? Right, we're going to broadly abolish the system whereby people gather for like caucuses and primaries on specific dates in a particular timetable. What we will instead replace is a situation whereby we will widen the pool of whom superdelegates are. Right, these are people who are elected officials within the Democratic Party and who hold influence. Right, what we would do is increase that to also contain people who are chairs of local state chapters within those parties and who have a significant amount of influence. Right, what this very much meets our burden at the point in which we are lowering the pool of people who can vote in effect to being from a point of 0.4 or 0.3 of what it currently is, right? Moreover, we will insist on whether they will all vote on the same day nationally, right? Any points of clarification on that? Grant. First point is substantive. Why primaries are unfair, right? We say, first of all, a major issue here, right, is that primaries can't all be held on the same day. Why is that, right? It's because, first of all, states can't be told that they should all hold their primary on the same day. Now, the Democratic Party has been trying to do this, but states at the point in which have sovereignty at the point in which they're allowed to hold elections on whatever day they choose to, right? Also, moreover, the Democratic Party is too concerned that they are dangerous to spread out, to have on a specific day and not be spread out. Like, why is that? Because they think if you have it all on one day, you might have a radical candidate who is popular at that moment being able to win at that point. Whereas if you spread it over time, there's feeling that the necessary challenges and financial burdens and obligations mean that those more radical candidates are eliminated. Right? That doesn't always work out, as I'll explain later. What does that do? It means the first in the nation states having a great deal of influence. Iowa and New Hampshire have a huge amount of capacity to decide who gets to win. Broadly, in most election cycles, it doesn't really go beyond South Carolina. It's lucky to get the Super Tuesday. So broadly, only 13 or 14 states get to pick who they want to win. No, thank you, right? Why is this specifically problematic? Broadly just in the sense, right, that it's really bad at the point in which many, 36 or 37 states get no influence on who the national candidate is. Moreover, why do we say, specifically comparatively, our solution doesn't have that problem, right? First of all, we say once you have this specifically just in the control of the DNC, they will now be able to, the Democratic National Committee, they will be able to specifically choose that date in a manner now that they don't have to interact with states. This is specifically their decision. Also, the point in which there's now super delegates, the problem of them needing to stretch it out to be radical, to be less radical, doesn't exist at the point in which they can trust these people to broadly be not voting for candidates who are specifically radical. I keep saying DNC, but yeah, the GOP should also policy as well. Also, right, there is another party in America. Also, specifically why Iowa and New Hampshire are specifically really bad states to have early, right? And are in a position that's currently entrenched that won't go away unless we have another policy implemented, right? Iowa and New Hampshire are disproportionately more white than the rest of America, right? It means that when that occurs, it means specific candidates do very well there. That gives them momentum. When a candidate seems to be winning, they tend to take that momentum and go into Super Tuesday and in later states and do well. Note if a candidate doesn't poll well in Iowa and New Hampshire, they can't go on to gain the funding and the political momentum to win less states. Also specific exact problems here is New Hampshire has a massive problem, and so it tends to be likely historically to give insurgent candidates massive amounts of support. They did that with Walter Mondale in '84. They did that with McGovern in '72. They tend to pick candidates and then give them the necessary momentum, even though they're not nationally that specifically popular. Doing so then places the vibe. People historically have been shown to polling that they tend to back a winner. When you see someone that's winning a state, even if that isn't a representative sample, you necessarily think that's a good thing. You go with that. Our policy specifically removes for that problem. Before I move on, I will say anyone. Yeah, Peter. Go on.
Surely that issue could be solved by just moving the state that they voted in the first time.
You missed all of my analysis that I talked about earlier about why that is impossible. When the voting is involved, states have complete control over when they get to pick that. But moreover, secondly, and more importantly, at the point at which it's everyone voting, the DNC and DOP are a bit too worried about letting all of them go on the one day in case they make one hell of a terrible decision, right? But moreover, specifically, I'm going to explain to you why, to a lesser extent, they still do make terrible decisions regarding on the status quo regarding radicalisation and polarisation of government, right? Specifically, we say comparatively here, it's important to note that we think our policy will get less radicalised people chosen forward at the point in which these are all broadly mainstream people who want things like electability, who want things with the main values of the Republican and Democratic candidates. By virtue of being elected officials, they are inherently less likely to be outsiders. Like, that's important to be comparative to the rest of the analysis I'm going to explain about why status quo encourages radicalism. Right? We've noticed in later time that radicals, it's good to be radical to get elected and more in like the wider Democratic pools and Republican pools. Why is that? Because like media tends to cover radical candidates, see what's occurring with Donald Trump, but broadly there's a lot of disinterest and like alienation from government. This isn't specifically too much of a recent trend. Like we can see this is occurring because the systems I explained to you before. Look at Barry Goldwater in 1964, Walter Mondale in 1984, McGovern in 72, and now Trump again in 2012. The history has shown that these radicals have been nominated. Now the first three I mentioned specifically all did lose spectacularly, right? Because they were too radical for the American mainstream. Realistic chance happens to Trump. Why is that bad? If one of the parties picks someone who's incredibly radical, they lose in a crushing landslide from the outset, right? There isn't a good general election. Like, you know, in the context there, Ronald Reagan and Nixon and Johnson won spectacular victories. They barely have to campaign. They barely have to like try and convince people to vote for them. That's specifically problematic at the point where it's the general election, you don't have a campaign occurring between two people. But moreover, like this, we say when these radical candidates occur, they drive a wedge in politics and make a more polarised system occurring. We're at the point at which, first of all, like broadly they're unelectable, right? But in the context that they actually do win, right? And like as insofar as we see, like like elections are highly volatile things. Anything can change. You get like in American politics the infamous like October surprise, whereby something can radically change what occurs. Meaning that those people do get these radicals could potentially get elected. This is unfathomable. Like as Owen will say later, that Trump would be elected. Broadly meaning that means it makes it harder for governance to happen. But moreover, when you see when you're a local politician and you see at a national level that radicalism works, that radicalism can get you a nomination, that means at local level, specifically in congressional primaries, where like you're in for example, where lots of the majority in Congress, the GOP, like specifically are in seats that are safe in the general election but competitive in the primaries. That means you encourage more radical people to come along. That means the Congress itself gradually shifts consistently to the right, which is really problematic because Congress is broadly heavily gerrymandered so that Democrats can't win it. So when the Republicans continue to shift consistently to the right, that effectively means it gets harder for governance to happen. You get more deadlock. You get it harder for you to be able to pass things like budgets, for like compromise policies to work, and for balanced government to broadly get right. We say on our side of the House, we make it less likely for you to get radical and polarised candidates to be nominated. We think that's a win in this debate. Incredibly happy to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech and call upon the Leader of the Opposition. Hear, hear.
Also, I would explicitly like to not be recorded, please.
Oh, okay.
Okay, yeah, I'm broadly just going to give you a comparison of the incentive, like the type of candidates who we picked by our super delegate kind of system or their system, and what the effects of that that will broadly be. First, two things to point out. So firstly, in terms of like just a general thing like to clear, right? Insofar as they miss the nuance that Chris tells you, the candidates they elect aren't just extreme, they find it incredibly difficult to govern because they're out of line with Congress, and I'll explain this more. Most of their benefits they try and tell you are purely discursive because they can't be transformed into policy that actually affects lives because these people have a very limited ability to affect policy they get in. We will point out insofar, and like this will become clear in direct cases, but as far as there's stuff about discursive stuff, as far as this pushes, especially Republican candidates, to be often say incredibly racist things, incredibly misogynist things, in terms of discursive benefits, we just think their side will lose because maybe white people are like, some people talk about policy sometimes, it's probably worse than people going on national television and saying horrible things in terms of discursive benefits. We're going to give you policy benefits as well. Okay, secondly, his thing he tries to sneak in at the end where he's like, also some benefits of primary as opposed to just giving us an uncomparative lambasting of our case, right? Two things he'll say on this, right? First he says, like, minorities get talked to in primaries, right? So firstly, no, it's often like a random set of like minorities, like South Carolinian black people get talked to because they're so early. Most other African Americans get entirely ignored. Like, see what he told us the makeup of most early states. Moreover, right, they often don't hold onto these. They they often have to make promises to these groups anyway for a general election. Why? Because the way you win an American presidential election is not just by convincing swing voters, but it always has to do with getting your base to come out and vote. That's why African Americans are always appealed to loads during general elections, despite like the claim people like to say they're not. They're actually very well tended to by the Democratic Party because they know they have to get out and vote because like they know African Americans vote for them. They just need to talk to them to get them to come out and vote in the first place. They need them excited about a campaign. That's why they have it. Like general election candidates will at least do it on a broad level. Okay, so onto the stuff, right? Like who are like. Firstly, just a reminder of the people who are voting on their side of the house, right? Because it's primaries, most only allow like registered voters. But anyway, the people who are most likely to vote are the people who are most invested in the party. That means you get self-selecting ideologues, people who consider themselves Republicans or Democrats in the first place. Note, this tends to mean the most surefire way to win over voters is because, you know, the one unifying trait of all voters is that they think they're like party X. In a binary system like America, then the way to, a surefire way to qualify yourself is to say, like if you're running through the Republican nominee, distinguishing yourself as much as possible from the Democrats, because you know that's one thing all your voters don't like. That means it tends towards people pushing as far away from the centre as possible, because that's how you distinguish yourself in a wide field of other candidates. It pushes to extremism. Those are the candidates who get elected then, because that's the most common thing shared by all voters in this thing. That's why you tend to get very extreme candidates elected, right? What will we think our candidates do, right? No, thank you. Because we obviously realise this problem with moneyed interest. We obviously realise our people will pick the perfect candidate. We also think like they have a perfectly good incentives to do good things, right? Like firstly, we think they'll have dual interest. They'll want an electable candidate because like their lives get actively better if they have a president of their party in it. Like they're more able to pass policy. They're probably more likely to be popular on a local level because they're actually able to fulfill the promises that they want. Like they're easier able to do that if they have a president who works with their party, right? They also want one who is broadly in line with the party views, right? They don't want to just elect a centrist president because that's like a president less likely to follow through with their agenda, right? So they think they have those two incentives, right? Firstly, they critique, they list to try and give us a bunch of problems with them. So firstly, one thing about money, like super PACs, we just think this is quite uncomparative. Super PACs dominate most primaries, right? Like consistently, like even if there's some outliers you can point out, people with more money do better in elections, right? That just happens on your side of the house anyway, right? But there are other problems, so we think that's a minor issue in this case. More things they say is, okay, like firstly, like because they're all like elected Republicans, they're actually more radical than the voters we're talking about. This is on two nuances of Chris' case. First, it's the process of having these candidates compete with self-selecting ideologues for months on end that tends towards this thing. So it's the month-long process that delivers you these radical candidates in the first place. But moreover, we think elected officials just have a very good idea of who wins elections and how the political system works because they have to deal with it every day. They know who's a good candidate to have in charge. It's not Ted Cruz because he just does stupid things and he won't work with a lot of mainstream Republicans, right? It'll be someone that they know will work with the things they want to do because if they have a good relationship with the president, they can get more things back to their candidates. They tell you there's factionalism in this election. No, thank you. Yes, but that's like factionalism we're broadly more okay with because that's the factionalism of elected, like broad elected officials. The only factions that will get any say in this are things that are actually factions on a large nationwide level. Like people, like the Tea Party can't be fully ignored from the process because they do represent a large portion of Americans, right? We tell you overwhelmingly, as these people all cast their ballot, it will go towards a centrist candidate with maybe some consideration for outsider groups. No, thank you. So yeah, like we tell you, you will end up with like a broadly centrist candidate, someone who goes along with lines, like maybe has some sort of like moneyed interest, but I can't remember the last time there was an American presidential nominee who wasn't fully like funded by Wall Street. So that's like uncomparative, right? We tell you things he did. Why is that better then? Why is that better in this system? Two things. Firstly, no thank you.
You tell us that radicalisation happens as a result of campaigning over time for the votes of people who describe themselves as ideologues. This still happens on your side because you still have multiple candidates campaigning over time for the votes of these superdelegates. So it's not clear how this process changes the radicalisation at all.
Right. Well, we wanted not a big long campaign period. You said you kept talking about why a big long campaign period. What we moreover say though is it's because you have specific incentives. You know, so you want someone who can like work well and you like work well with you and work well within the system, and you also have a good idea of who is an actually electable candidate because you're more familiar with elections than the hiring process, right? So why is it good? Firstly, we think it's more representative, right? The candidates you end up with are people who more broadly fall in line with the general voter, and then when the general voter is much more many voters just are left out of the primary process. When they actually tune into the main election, they have a candidate who they care about and identify with and can actually like want to vote for as opposed to being forced to vote for, so a Democrat or Republican doesn't get it. Secondly, we tell you, you get much better governance, and this is important because even if our candidate is only like fulfilling like the will of like 60% of the things people want to do, and they get one who does 90%, we get one who is like much more mainstream, much more able to work with Congress. So the policies that do happen, even if he misses out on some discussions and some policies, he's much better able to he or maybe she is much more able to enact these things. And so yeah, that's broadly why it's good. I mean, there's a critique on America because they don't elect women. No, I'm not sexist.
And I'd like to thank the speaker for the fine speech and call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Hear, hear.
Okay, let's look at a few things. Let's first of all look at their problem of the times at which these state primaries are held. They are building a mech around reliance on this being able to happen on the same day. Recognise this is not mutually exclusive from the prop, given that it's potentially still a primary, even if it still happens on the same day. Not defending that, just pointing it out. Point out also we could randomise at every electoral cycle from op as well to deal with the problem they're talking about. So it's not always Iowa and New Hampshire that have the very important starting say to begin with. We point out also it's presumably not a good thing to cut primaries down, given that primaries are forcing candidates to campaign in virtually every state, which makes it much more difficult to ignore people from particular areas. This is incredibly important given the importance of access to democracy in a presidential campaign. This is someone who is of unique symbolic and powerful importance. We think principally and practically it's important that it is as democratic as possible. The campaigning on side proposition is much worse because they have to target it at everybody at the same time. This is a force towards the middle ground, not listening to nuanced issues, not targeting individual people. You have very little incentive to make a big effort to make sure that everybody is heard. Next of all, let's look at the question of radicals. So they're worried about nominating radicals on their side of the house. First of all, it's not obvious why this is a particular harm on prop. Recognise that the worst possible case scenario for them is that Trump gets elected as US president. Now, while I don't think that's a great idea, I'm not sure who prop are to tell the US electorate that they are wrong should they choose to do so in a democratic system. No thank you. But short of that, since opening government accept that radicals appear all the time without actually becoming president or having any positions of power, we accept that the reality of the case, as opposed to the highest possible burden of the case, is much lower than that. It seems a much more limited harm. So to the extent that a harm does exist, we're happy to defend that as part of broadening political horizons more generally. No thank you. We're happy to chalk that up as just views that are testing norms. We think testing views which are considered as ordinary, considered as norms, are incredibly important to challenge, particularly in a democracy where you need to be able to consent to the power that state is holding against you. This consent is only meaningful if you genuinely did have alternatives to that. If you're constantly being offered the same type of person and the same type of suit, then this isn't genuine consent to state coercion. Recognise there are genuine practical as well as those principled implications to this, right? This means it's genuinely possible under their model that you're not getting people challenging the established elite. You're not getting people like Sanders standing on a platform against Hillary, arguing for policies which probably fall under radical if you cast the umbrella wide enough. Now, recognise this opportunity to this increased scope allows people to actually vote for different people and directly produce change, but it also allows you to shape the particular policies of the people who ultimately get elected anyway, even if it is the radical types. Because if you can find specific policies within there that appeals to a wide proportion of the electorate, then you get the increased access from those. Next of all, let's look at minority engagement, because we think this is a significant problem for a proposition in terms of building on some substantive. Like, recognise when you have ethnic minorities or poor people that could otherwise be ignored, a state primary is a key platform for which to care about their views. Like, recognise we're talking about instances where outcomes can often be very tight and a few percentages can make a big difference either way. Uniquely, on side opposition, you have the time and the incentive to campaign for 1 or 2% extra votes in one very specific geographical area. This means you're likely to get policies tailored specifically towards these people, promises that have to be later kept if you're ever successful. The alternative is literally being ignored. Why is this true? Because in the alternative world, in Prob's world, Democrats can broadly rely on just being a bit less crap than the alternative and rely on getting those votes, right? So they don't have to do literally anything to meaningfully improve the lives of poor people. But nevertheless, it will still look worse to elect the party that's doing even less for them. This isn't meaningful improvement for those people's lives. This isn't democracy. It's not listening to them. I'll take closing.
Yeah, so in a state-by-state primary system, do you think the types of promises that are made by candidates state-by-state are ones that can actually be delivered and are not mutually exclusive with other states?
Well, that is clearly for the electorate to decide, right? Obviously, there's a massive opportunity cost to continue to make promises that can't be kept. To a degree, this happens in all electoral systems, but ultimately there are accountability mechanisms when you don't do that. Like, obviously, you don't just want to get elected once. You presumably want to be able to serve your second term. You presumably don't want to permanently tank the reputation of your political party, given that they want to get elected not just once more, but presumably 20, 50, 1,000 times more going down the line. You have campaign managers as well, employed specifically by the party with a legal duty towards the party to make sure you aren't causing reputational harm like that. Let's look at a few more of the claims that they have. First of all, they think that superdelegates are going to know better because they know what's good at winning elections. But point out, first of all, a pretty good test of how good you are at winning an election is having an election, first of all. But clearly, the only thing that a superdelegate has to go on is experience, which means specifically non-progressive attitudes, because they're looking at what has won elections in the past as opposed to what might win elections in the future, never challenging the current norm. Recognise also that the skill in persuading some elitist superdelegates to back you is a very different skill than having to persuade an electorate, and they don't always cross over. We point out finally on this that clearly this is something that is more susceptible to corruption bias, given that it's a few people at the elite that you have to persuade to vote for you, or that big super PACs have to, or lobby groups have to fund, as opposed to the entire electorate. On super PACs, recognise first of all, they do accept that Wall Street funds almost every candidate anyway, so it's not clear what massive difference they're making on their side of the house. The difference is on our side, you're getting better grassroots funding from constituencies, when you're able to prove that you're listening to people in each state, when you can build up trust over time, both on issues and on trust on the fact that you might be able to win. Again, people will not take a superdelegate guarantee to with the same reliance as they might take concrete winning elections. Finally, on selecting voters, producing super hardline radicals, recognise that people don't vote the way the opening governments say, because they want someone who's going to be elected nationally at the end of it as well. So the second best candidate within their own party might still be much better than anything that the opposition party might offer them.
I thank that speaker for a fine speech and call upon the members of government to hear here. There are many ways to abolish a primary. One example was offered to us by our opening government team. We think that that's a good idea. We think that other ways to abolish a primary could also exist and exist within my argumentation, as does theirs. They're not mutually exclusive. We also stand behind a system possibly of P or STV, Keith says I'm spelling that right, where you go to a general election and all candidates come forward. That is also a thing that we could do. Right, okay. The incentive to promise, parochial kind of promises when you go state by state is my first point. Then I'm talking about, within that I'm talking about minorities, the last thing I want to talk about. Then I'm going to talk about a democratic deficiency, and finally the structural flaws within the primary system. Okay. You promise in Iowa that you want to have ethanol subsidies because they love that in Iowa, they laugh that up, right? That's mutually exclusive, however, with your promise of green energy when you go to a liberal state, and that's what they laugh up, right? The thing is, when you go state by state and promise them what they want to hear, most of these promises are A, either mutually exclusive, or B, you don't care about actually living up to these promises when you do get elected. You just want to win that state in the first place. What happens is, these people run on false platforms that are tailored to the states that they're trying to win at a particular time. See, in Iowa, Ted Cruz is Mr. Big Evangelical who didn't really like women, but when he was in New Hampshire, women weren't really that evil and maybe they shouldn't have rights, right? This means, right, that people think that they are voting in their best interests, right? But they actually aren't, because those politicians have no intention or capacity to keep these promises once they are elected, right? We also think that the national leader should care about national issues, like the US's role in the greater world, and foreign policy, and what consists of overstepping of the executive branch, right? And whether they should start bombing Libya or not, right? But stances on these issues are not talked about in the primary system, because instead they're just talking about state by state issues, right? Not the national level stuff, right? Instead, you get the candidates coming out about how religious they are when they're in a religious state, or how really interested they really are in Black Lives Matter when they're in a state where there might be more of a black presence there, right? This is a myopic way of choosing a national leader, and so we think that's flawed. But we also think it's flawed because they don't even live up to the stuff of representing each state individually anyway, right? This ties into the stuff about minorities, the last thing I want to talk about. We think that when Hillary can call black kids super predators in certain states and boast about being tough on crime and how her husband was tough on crime, right? And then pretend that she thinks that she cares about black lives and how much they matter, right? We think that her allegiance to these people is built on the fact that they can win her a state, not that she actually cares about them, right? No, thank you. Right, okay. Now, onto the democratic deficiency that's inherited in the primary system, right? We think that the primary system is gerrymandering that can never be solved. Why? Okay, because at a national level, black people, for example, there are other minorities within the states, obviously, right? But black people, for example, are an important voting bloc on the national level. However, within each state, their voting power is underrepresented on a state level due to the explicit gerrymandering by the Republican Party, who hold Congress, Senate, and lots of governorships, right? And it has historically gerrymandered certain districts and regions in order to suppress the black vote within state lines to ensure that they hold they win that governorship or that tightly contested race. No, thank you, right? So this is bad because it means when you run on a state by state level, minority votes are suppressed. Whereas if you ran on a national level, those kind of gerrymandered districts would disappear because everyone would be running on the same day. That follows, right? Also, things I'll take it then because of death. Also, densely populated small states like Rhode Island, right, have a disproportionate say. This means that the states with small populations, rural states, have a less proportionate say, right? We think it is undemocratic when an ardent Jeb Bush fan, just like myself, just kidding, right? But he's funny, right? When an ardent Jeb Bush fan in Florida never got the chance to vote for him because he was knocked out by someone else, right? We think that's denying you your democratic right to exercise your vote and have it be equal to anyone else's, right? The person in Florida is not equal to the person in Iowa because the person in Iowa knocked out the candidate that they wanted to vote for. Yes, Stephen, you're very agitated. Go on.
Okay.
So your solution is to replace it by a clusterfuck of PRSVD system or openings case, which is just hand all the keys over to the white people. Why is that more representative and why would that keep people involved?
Okay, well, first of all, I said it's more representative because they can't lie to people all the time, like going state by state and make these mutually exclusive promises, right? But I'm also just going to talk about the inherent flaws in the primary system that you have to stand over and you have to tell us why they're so good, right? And this ties into the last week and how they were talking about super PACs, right? Okay. When you were campaigning in Nevada and you're organising volunteers to go out and canvass for you, possibly caucus for you, I think they wanted to get rid of that, but there's a point where they can't get rid of absolutely everything they don't like about the primary system, or they're not really standing over the primary system anymore, right guys, come on. But anyway, so that requires mass adaptability at little notice, right? So candidates like Bernie Sanders, that they want to stand over and they say it's really great when we get like plurality, right? But the thing is, what happens to Bernie Sanders is that he can't build ground support in each state in America in 4 days, right? It's literally impossible for him. That's why he was able to win in New Hampshire, because he had months and months and months to get his message across. But he was trashed in South Carolina because Hillary is a household name and he had 4 days to try and get his message across. His message was a little bit too nuanced for that, right? Candidates that survive this kind of system, right, where you go state to state in primaries, are the ones, and the constant uprooting of your campaign from one state to another, right, are the kind of people who have celebrity status, who have mass media coverage in the media that spreads their message very quickly, like Donald Trump, who says outrageous things, which means that the media covers him, which means that people hear his name and recognise his name, or as they do the same with Hillary, right? And they have the money to pump into advertising to make sure that they are recognised within these states. You do not have time when you're moving from Nevada to South Carolina to Ohio to Massachusetts, right, day by day, week by week, right, to create a nuanced understanding of your policy or a moderate message. What instead you do is you yell your message louder than everyone else, right? What happens then is the moderates are driven out. Why? Because non-support begets more non-support. So, see, if you lose Nevada, people in South Carolina lose faith in you and won't caucus for you or won't vote for you because they're like, this person is already falling behind the pack, I should support someone else, right? So how candidates maintain their momentum in the primary system is by attacking each other viciously, right, and posturing themselves as the winner. On our side, Bernie is selling his ideas to Democratic leaders over a year, not like the public, in a media frenzy in 4 days, right? So we think it'll be easier for him, like, it will be given that space of time nationally to bring these moderate viewpoints across. So Becky, you should propose this.
I thank that speaker for a final speech and to move on the member of opposition. Hear, hear.
Madam Chair, I just want to start with some framing about how the US actually works, right? We say that the US is an extremely polarised system due to an almost exact 50-50 split in the population between a very dispersed rural population and a very concentrated urban population. Do you see that in any given state, often like a massive portion of the population will vote for the Democrats, but almost every single county in the US votes for the Republicans, right? You say there's also a history of like a uniquely damaging history of racial issues in the US. We think that primaries get the best possible outcome in this like very specific and unique situation, for reasons I'm going to explain to you in our extension, right? We're going to have two main plans for extension, right? So first off, like why this leads, we think, to presidential candidates knowing more about state issues and engaging with them better. We think that's distinct from a vote. So what we're going to tell you is why, like each state specifically, like campaigning in each state matters, and how that affects the long-run presidential race and the presidency they have in the long run. And then secondly, our second plank of extension is we're talking about the psychological effect of getting to vote in each state in that primary, how that affects the presidential race, why you get better outcomes due to that. A few changes to the first. Like, so in response to the extension that we get from CG, right? So we say, first of all, like, surely national issues will be discussed in the actual presidential election. We don't think they're cut out by the fact that you have primaries. We think that doesn't stand. We think that even if all this stuff about lying is true, right, it's still unclear as to why you get a better outcome on their side. It's unclear why politicians wouldn't lie in like on TV trying to get the presidential election. We're unclear why fewer lies happen, or why those lies like have a specific, unique, bad impact. We don't think they prove that to you. Lastly, on the Bernie Sanders issue, we think that issue surely gets even worse when you only have a presidential election, in terms of like outsider candidates not being able to get in, when you only have a presidential election, and it is only people who are in the party elite, in that inside, who are able to pick those nominees. We think that that's a major thing they failed to explain. We think that their case on that issue can't stand because of it. The other strange bit of rebuttal is regarding regarding the OG mechanism, right? So we're totally unclear as to why you can't have all the elections on the same day, outside of the fact that it's not currently done. I said state sovereignty. We point out that the government parties are like separate entities to the states. We're unclear as to why they can't have like that specific like thing that they do separate to the states. I'll let you in a moment. We also think that you can move the first vote to a less white state if they're so worried about the racial demographics of the first state having such a big impact on the election. We're unclear as to why they can't randomise, given that government parties are separate entities to the states themselves and can legitimately say they're going to have the election on the day that they want, given that they are that separate entity.
First of all, even if they do randomise, that gives disproportionate power to the first states. But moreover, state law in places like New Hampshire and Iowa means that effectively, means that they. No, it's gone.
Okay, look, we think it might be an imperfect system. We think it's better than the alternative would be because we think it actually forces politicians to engage in state issues in each place. Leading me nicely on to my first part of my extension. Okay, so then I'll give it the paper. Okay, so what we say is, right, that when you have to campaign in each area that you will eventually be governing as the president, right, you are forced to engage with the issues in that area. You're forced to learn things about those issues. I think that's very important in the US because the US is such a massive amount of territory, and you end up governing such a large number of states that all have quite unique issues, that all have quite unique economies that can work in different ways. We think that if a president doesn't have to go through that process, right, they can end up ignoring some of the issues in some of those states, not necessarily on purpose, because as I explained to you earlier, like the US socially is just very diverse between that rural and urban split, and a politician from one of those areas might just not understand the issues in a more Republican rural area, or vice versa. Like a perfectly Republican might not understand democratic issues or the issues that you see in cities, right? So we think it's important that they need to go through that process of campaigning in order to learn about that. We think that you need to appeal to a majority of individuals who are willing to vote in that primary in each state in order to have a chance of being represented. In order to do that, you need to learn things about each of those states. You need to go on a campaign trail. You need to learn things about each of those, right? We think, so secondly, right, we think that, okay, no, thank you. We think that okay, as president, you're going to have to make certain concessions, right? You're going to have a bunch of constituencies that want to do different things. We think that if you go through that process of campaigning, you have more information about each of those states. You're able to make fairer decisions in terms of just having all the information you need to say, okay, well, this issue is more important than this issue, or this thing would be nice for this state, but it will also crash the state's economy, therefore we can't do this. We think that this is also like a bit of a rebuttal to the idea of like promise making. We say like necessarily you're going to have to make some compromises. We think that primaries make better thought out compromises that have better impact on that society as a whole. We think that the politicians also see these compromises they need to make as president earlier than they would if the presidential race just happened straight away, right? Because necessarily you're going to have to spend longer on a campaign if you want to do primaries first. The fact that you're thinking about these compromises already when you're doing the primary means that you make better decisions when you come to become president. You have more institutions in place ready for when you become president. Because even before the actual presidential race starts, you know that you're going to have to start making these decisions. You know you're going to have to start thinking about, okay, do I give subsidies to this state or this state? Do I let easier trade happen in this state or that state? Do I give more funding to police in this state or that state? Right? We think that's important. We think that's very useful. No, thank you. Another bit of rebuttal under this comes to Owen's stuff. So okay, and also against May's idea of attacking other politicians. Right? We think that because you're going to have to be in a presidential race afterwards, right? You actually do have a disincentive from going completely insane. You can't just go crazy right wing and crazy left wing and endlessly attack the other party because you need people from that party to vote for you in the actual election. You need swing voters in order to be elected. That's incredibly important. We think that's incredibly important. We think you're therefore not incentivized to be insane on that issue. So we think that point falls. So then, moving on to the second plank of our extension, we say that there's a psychological effect to getting to vote in elections closer to local level, right? Because it means that you see members of that campaign team in your local town, or like in a town that is at least nearer to you than it would be if they were doing all the campaigning in Washington DC, and it was just all happening like really, really far away from you. We think that makes then you see that candidate as a real person that you have a chance of influencing. We think that doesn't happen in the national election because politicians are incredibly unlikely to campaign in any given local area. We think that's good because we think it makes individuals who are disenfranchised more likely to think they can have an impact on politics. Hence, more of them are likely to vote in the actual presidential election later on. We think that's important, right? Because while a minority vote can never win you an election, if there's a split between the majority, as there often is in the US, where it's like, as I said before, it's roughly 50-50 who are in the demographics that tend to vote Republican and tend to vote Democratic. There can be a balance of power held by a minority grouping that is able to swing an election. Therefore, and the more minorities vote, the bigger that the gap can be, and they can still swing the election, right? So we think more minority voting is better because that minority vote becomes more important to who becomes president. The more important that vote is, the more the parties want to cater to that vote. You see now, even if the Republican Party has had fairly horrible policies regarding race issues in the past, they're not very good about it. They have at least realized that they need to stop alienating Hispanic and Black voters. So they want to have a chance of not being knocked out in every every presidential election in the future, right? I know Donald Trump is not great for that. Like the actual Republican establishment hates it, and that's part of why. We think that this is important. Therefore, we think it's important that they vote. Regarding any other bits of rebuttal, we think it's like this implicitly like takes down the alienation point the prop side have made. We've explained to you what that's to get as the polarized electoral system. We think primaries actually lead to more engagement by minority individuals. We think this clashes directly with their stuff and takes it down comprehensively. We're very happy to oppose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for a fine speech and call on the government whip. Hear, hear.
So, in opening and closing of the proposition case, Christ on fucking mighty. This has been a fairly messy debate, so I'm going to try and scupper what I can from it, okay? Look, I'm going to be talking about three main points of clash. I'm going to be talking about radicalism and who gets it less on their side, or what kind of radicalism exactly flourishes on either side. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about democracy, which side delivers it better and why it's important. And lastly, I'm going to be talking about the democratic deficiencies that occur on either side, where they occur much more on their side, right? Firstly, a few pieces of extraneous rebuttal. So, the things that we get from the last speaker are two things which are extraneous, right? Firstly, he tells us that you've got a disincentive to go crazy right-wing or crazy left-wing because of the primary process and things like this. No, recognize this is not the fact, right? When you go crazy right-wing or go crazy left-wing under the primary system, you are doing this because you recognize that in that state there are people who are persuaded by that kind of rhetoric, so that you can shore up that enclave, that finite number of delegates as a dependable vote, right? You can backtrack on it later, but what you have already done is you've gamed the system so that little enclave, those guaranteed delegates that you can get, have been fired up and are going to be extremist. And they're always going to be that way because they're going to keep on believing it, even when you moderate your national image, because you've turned them into acolytes of yours, see Trump's user base. Secondly, this psychological effect of seeing people up close and this is so dandy, right? Look, this isn't dandy, this isn't great. If they're not actually going to help you, the effect of making them think that you're connected to them is you're just playing lies, basically. It's making people have a false consciousness that the politicians are actually connected to them, right? If you see people working close in your states and things like that, and it makes you feel enfranchised and make you feel like you want to vote for that person, if that is entirely against your interests, and the only reason that you're going to vote for them was because they showed up in your state on their nationwide trip around America, that's a really bad reason to vote for them. And we think that any system that provokes really bad reasons for voting for people is a really bad system, right? He said that maybe this will have the advantage of just enfranchising minorities a little bit more. I'm going to be talking about why, in the long term, you're probably going to disenfranchise minorities an awful lot more. In fact, actually, it's the first point of class I'm going to deal with. So, May brought you this analysis about why the system of, the incentive structure that exists in state-to-state primaries, which is kind of something that these guys need to stand over because it is kind of intrinsic to the primary system, otherwise they're just picking and choosing tiny bits of primaries that they like, right? The system of state-to-state primaries means that you do have very rational incentives to be able to make mutually exclusive or contradictory promises to states, right? Why is this the case? First of all, you get away with it, right? It is not always the case that the state next door, the state on the other side of the country, is going to be able to keep an eye on the promises that you are making to another state. It is not always the case as well that people in that state are going to know that they are mutually exclusive or contradictory statements and they can't promise everything to everyone. They are just going to take it at face value, right? It is in the incentive structures of people who go state to state try and win all of those states, particularly under the primary system where there are winner-takes-all states, where anyone who gets the most amount of votes gets all of the delegates, something that's hugely problematic, right? What does this mean?
Response?
No. It means that, when you make these false promises to people, right, you are eventually, going to be found out that they're lies. We're not sure, over what kind of long-term, short-term this is going to happen, but quite often it does happen. See Obama when people became massively disenfranchised with him and didn't vote in, their council elections and things like that, because they felt that, do you know what, the Democratic Party isn't able to live up to these big promises that they made, right? What does this mean? It means that we get, in the long-term, greater disenfranchisement, we told you, right? When, Peter comes up here and says that this is a great thing to make, minorities interface with the democratic process and things like that. If they feel and they discover that they are just being given, blank promises going state to state, they are going to be given no reason to enfranchise and to interface with the state. No. So, secondly, moving on to the democratic deficiencies, right? The other point, a piece of, extension that we, was completely unresponded to, right? Look, we told you that, minority votes are already suppressed under the status quo, right? And to a degree, a bit on either side. But it's particularly pernicious and bad on their side, right? Because recognise that states, in the ways that they are drawn up and the ways that they are gerrymandered by self-interest parties within those states, mean that the delegates that are, appointed to, that the delegates themselves are also gerrymandered within those states, right? It means that that it's incredibly unlikely and it's incredibly hard for a candidate who is pro Black Lives Matter or pro Black lives in general to be able to get a foothold in those states, right? It means that the minority interest that would be the case if it was some kind of national election is compounded in the system where you have primary elections because it comes down to winning these gerrymandered states state by state. No thanks. Another reason as well, it's hugely there's a huge democratic deficient onto the primary system is the other stuff that they brought you. Firstly, disproportionately represented states because the primary system was conceived in a really bad way and it was decided that Rhode Islanders are worth 3 times Floridans and things like that. It also means that these states, sometimes disproportionately, sometimes who are sometimes disproportionately represented, get to decide what the election field looks like down along the line for other states. Even if they want to randomise it, like these guys say that they want to do, it is principally unjust that just because someone's state happens to get to vote before you, that they get to decide what kind of field you get to choose from. Right? We think that is principally unjust and it lessens people's choice, which is something we should try to maximise in democracy. Also, the people who are critically affected on this are Middle America, people who maybe because of party rules aren't allowed to vote in their caucuses or in their primaries, right? These people have their field severely deprived of candidates that they may or may not want to vote for. Particularly when it comes to moderate candidates, as I'm going to point out in the last point of the commission, particularly about radicalism. Go on, back up.
Okay, you talk about protecting minorities and caring about minorities and believe they should be people who are heard. But you're fine for Rhode Island to get trounced on by California in elections. Why is that?
Because Rhode Islanders as a minority are relatively well off. The moment that there's a Rhode Island Lives Matter movement, maybe I wouldn't care about them as a minority. But we just don't see a critical need to protect Rhode Island as a minority, right? Bizarre point to make, right? Lastly, let's talk about radicalism and why it happens more so on their side of the house. Look, when you have state-to-state primary systems, what people have to do is they have a short-term turnaround in terms of tailoring their message specifically to that state and to that state's needs. What does that mean? As May tells you, it means that you have to be able to just go hardline on what those states like. With the promises that we tell you about, you have to make those promises. But it also pays to make those promises fairly hardline. I absolutely will not cut ethanol subsidies in Iowa and things like that. Or if you're in a particularly evangelical state, that I would bring Christianity back into politics or something like that, right? It's an easy thing to do when it wins votes easily, which is critically important, when you're just trying to win delegates within these states, right? It means that you get more radical candidates emerging because it is the easiest way to do it when you have these short turnarounds within these states and things like that. Contrast with any other kind of system, whether it's the one that these guys want to go with, where you screen them with party members who have acumen and aren't extremists by virtue of them being around a while, or the system that we'd be happy to stand behind as well, where it's put to the general populace, not on a state-by-state basis where people get extremists because of the promises that they make. Much less radicalism on either side. We think that that's important because radicalism always eventually has to hurt someone, and usually a minority. And that's why radicalism is actually bad, and these guys seem to be okay with radicalism on some scenarios. Very happy to do this.
I'd like to thank that speaker for a fine speech and call upon the opposition whip to hear.
On Rhode Island, congratulations, you beat the example and made a joke. Unfortunately for you, that doesn't make a substantive, meaningful argument or rebuttal to the general point that some states do need protection in response to this material about Rhode Islanders getting hard. Recognise there are states with small populations that under their system would not have the voting power to have their voices heard, but still their lives should matter and should be something counted for. I want to just clarify something up. I'm really sorry to be this wanker, but this is a would motion. It's not a believes motion. You need to give us an actual comparative that actually stands on its own 2 feet, or isn't a technocracy like we got from opening government. We would actually like this to be a critique based on a comparative. You guys getting up and saying this system might not work that well isn't a debate. That is you saying a statement that we could even probably concede and say, well, it's still better than any alternative we win. Your alternatives will trunch them anyway. Second of all, just to get rid of this promise stuff, right? This is we'll crush ethanol studies, and then when I go to the country and say I'm very evangelical. That's not lying. That's Ted Cruz being Ted Cruz, right? That's what he believes, what he does. A lot of these things are actually quite consistent. A lot of them do have a similar base in many states. There are some nuances, stuff like ethanol studies being specific to certain states. Right, I'll deal more of this type of stuff later. Okay, 2 questions in this debate. 1, engagement in discourse. Second of all, issues and policies. 1, who does this engage? Let's just go through this case by each side of the bench. One, elites, people who are part of the establishment. Oh, I told you why this was difficult when it's only party insiders are the ones who have the ability to vote. This is a Voge's mechanism. It's really problematic when that happens because recognized anti-establishment is something that happens within parties all the time. We see it as the domineering feature of the current Republican deal when you have Cruz, Trump, and to a lesser extent Rubio, who are all anti-establishment, or Rubio less so, but who are outside the establishment, but now as a protest candidate because they want general change within that party and how that party operates. It means you just destroy those candidates and their ability to be elected whatsoever. Also, it removes the party from actual people who actually matter in this state, like actual normal people and not just people who spend their lives as the treasurer of the GOP, or Nevada branch, right? Those are people that matter, and it also affects their election trend. This is quite important. Why? Because it means they're less likely to vote, because they are one step removed again from the democratic process and how the executive is appointed, right? If all the stuff they say about the primaries being really bad is true, this makes it much worse because you're actually just physically removing them from the process altogether. We don't care if they vote for crazy people. We think there's crazy people on both sides, and we're happy if they vote for crazy people. It's not us to say who's crazy and who's not crazy, right? We do have constitutions and all to mend a lot of the damages that can be done by crazy people. Also, they say but they can't make policies, right? That limits all the damage what crazy people can do when they get into power, right? It means that they can't do much damage. Also, right, just on this, to be clarified, just deal with the radicalization stuff. If there's a case that, this person won't be able to make laws a day in the party, no one will work with them. That is a campaign issue. That is something that gets discussed. Cruz and Rubio have been hammering Trump on this recently. Who's your candidate going to be? You don't have one, right? This is a political issue that gets discussed in stuff like primary debates, which happen. Alright, deal with this the clusterfuck PRS-TV system. You want to put every presidential candidate, from not even after the nominations on a ballot? That is nuts. There's going to be 30 people on there. It means it's a lot harder to have the debates that actually have these matters discussed. A primary gives you a slow, thorough way to go through each candidate piece by bit over a long drawn out process and decide which one you'd like to vote for. That means people are generally better informed when they can watch debate after debate. A debate with 30 people on the same platform is not going to be a very good debate at all. No. Secondly, it empowers money to a lot greater extent then, because it is then only people who can put their advertisements across the board instead of people who are able to get votes across the board. That means that this provides, so money, right, just explain money in the US election. It has a very logarithmical return, right? So it means as you get more money, that money becomes generally more useful. See Jeb Bush. However, there's a particular caveat where a lot of candidates are like Bernie Sanders and the Obama campaign were able to generate huge vast amounts of money in 2008. That money and advertising can be used to project them further in primaries, which requires substantially less amount of money than a PRSD clusterfuck would. That means they're able to get onto the ballot and utilize everyday people to donate $5, and that happens 1 million times across the United States, generating huge revenue streams comparatively, and that's those people actually in the discussion. It's quite important. Third response. This stuff, that was big money. So it allows crowdfunding candidates to be saying it means minorities have an easier time getting their voice choice, other than a bigger system where there's much more money at play, and then that logarithmic return doesn't happen because you have to appeal to an entire country instead of state by state basis. Also on this stuff, Bernie Sanders only had 4 days to prepare in South Carolina. Look, Bernie Sanders not going to win South Carolina. That was probably a strategic resource allocation decision by that campaign. What it means though is a lot of the states already has stuff or live campaigns that are campaigning in states prematurely before the time they get there because they're the ones they know who win. There's no use wasting money. That is just a bad allocation of resources. Fourth, this thing about gerrymandering, right? We don't have to stand over all the bad things that happen in primaries, right? We have to say some stuff is bad, some stuff is good. Just to clarify on the road or random selection stuff. If it is comparative, right? If it's no comparative, random selection does provide a quite useful thing. Actually, this is my second one. Right, so going to step 1 here. This provides us a lens to focus on in specific state issues and have those discussed. On this stuff about promises not being kept, it is in every single incentive structure that a politician has to keep these keep these promises. Because one, looking at here, lying is a bad thing. See, the Trump campaign right now is being lambasted again by Rubio and Cruz for his stances on abortion 4 years ago, right? All this stuff gets brought up, and news stations love to publish this stuff, and it's something that will hammer you in a general election if you're going back on promises. It makes you look untrustworthy, it damages your electability. It is something politicians care about. They don't tend to go back on their promises. Stuff like ethanol doesn't make the news. Cruz does with ethanol policies after that. It's just no one cares about that, but it doesn't happen. Secondly, they say about
Okay, obviously anyone who knows anything about American politics knows you need to run candidates to appeal to minorities because otherwise you just lose. So we'd still get lots of appealing to minorities. But what you get on your side now is the general election, people can only pick between candidates who've been selected by radicals who don't align with the general populace.
No, your thing was No, that's just not how it works. Given the fact that minority states have to be appealed to, you can appeal to them. Your situation is just handed over to a bunch of white people. Not necessarily clear why that's comparatively better than a bunch of crazy people deciding things. Recognise that the crazy thing is just a straw man. Most campaign or like to do can arrest Gordon Mean. Why is there an incentive not to go crazy in the long run anyway? Just clear this up. Recognise that you have to fight a general election, and it means any craziness you got elected on probably does fizzle out to a small degree because you have to appeal to like the broad base of the American population, not just a subset of the American population, which is your party. This is why like Sanders or something will probably regress towards the right, the same with Rubio and the same with Cruz. So you can't go nuts, because if you do, you get lambasted for being a liar in the media, and if you do go nuts, and like you're probably just not going to get elected because people care about that type of thing when they're voting. People aren't that stupid. Look, at the end of this debate, there is no actual comparative that stands that isn't handing the keys to the house over to a bunch of white people and rich people who are able to climb the establishment of these parties. I mean, anti-establishment or politicians are massively disenfranchised, and it makes the voting process either non-existent on their side of the house. At least on our side, we have some comparative by which we allow minorities and states to be heard.
Okay, thanks everyone. Can we give another round of applause for our semi-finalists, please?